Picture a giant container ship. It's longer than 4 football fields. It weighs 200,000 tons. It's a floating city, moving under its own momentum with terrifying force. And then the captain gives the order to stop. From the bow of the ship, a piece of iron shaped like a hook drops into the water with a thunderous crash. Here's the question. How does that little chunk of metal stop something that massive? 99% of people will give the same answer. The anchor is heavy, it falls to the bottom, it catches on a rock or just sits there like a weight. And it keeps the ship from drifting away. That sounds logical. It sounds convincing. And it is completely, fundamentally wrong. Because what you see above the water is just the visible tip of an entirely different system. The real physics of an anchor is hidden deep beneath the surface. And once you understand how it actually works, you will never look at a ship at anchor the same way again. Let's start at the very beginning, the moment when humanity first faced the problem. How do you stop a boat? The first anchors in history were simply stones, heavy rocks with a hole drilled through them for a rope. Archaeologists pull them up by the thousands from the floor of the Mediterranean Sea. But here's what's extraordinary. On many of these ancient stones, the names of gods are carved or magical symbols. Because for the people of that time, stopping a ship in a storm was not an engineering problem. It was a conversation with the sea. Greek sailors believed the ocean was a living creature, a god. When a storm drove a ship toward the rocks, they threw the sacred anchor. Not just the heaviest stone, the most beautiful, the most revered, a sacrifice. They believed the gods would see this offering and hold the ship in place. Science offers a simpler explanation. The last stone was heavier than all the previous ones. Friction finally overcame the force of the wind, and the ship stopped. But the mystical awe of that last desperate hope never left the language of the sea. We still say, drop anchor, with a weight that goes beyond technical terminology. It's an ancient incantation that survived thousands of years. The Romans were the first to realize a stone is a bad anchor. Heavy, but it slides. They invented the stock, a crossbar of metal inserted through a wooden anchor. Why? This was a piece of engineering genius built on pure geometry. If you drop a flat anchor without a stock, it lands flat on the bottom and slides like a sled on ice. But the stock makes the anchor roll onto its side as it falls. When it hits the bottom, the crossbar presses against the ground, automatically rotating the anchor so that its pointed fluke aims directly into the seabed. No formulas, no calculations, just an intuitively understood principle of leverage. Gravity became humanity's ally. This is the anchor you see on tattoos and maritime club logos. The Admiralty anchor. 2 curved flukes, a crossbar at the top, a ring, the most recognizable symbol of the sea in the world, and simultaneously nearly useless on modern ships. Because it had one terrible problem. Its flukes sticking out in every direction made it impossibly awkward to handle. You couldn't simply retract it into the bow of the ship. It had to be hoisted by crane, disassembled in sections and lashed to the hull. In battle or in a storm that took hours. Hours nobody had. When steam engines arrived in the 19th century and speed changed everything, an engineer named Hawkins designed an anchor without a stock, with pivoting flukes shaped like crab claws. This design folded up and retracted directly into a pipe at the ship's bow in a single motion. Click, and the anchor disappeared. Beauty departed. Functionality arrived, but what few people know is that this transition saved thousands of lives not at sea, but in war. Because an anchor is not only a stopping device. History records moments when an anchor became a weapon. Take the Battle of Trafalgar in 1805. Admiral Nelson faced a task that looked impossible. The combined French and Spanish fleet was drawn up in a long line. Traditional tactics called for parallel formation and broadside-to-broadside gunnery. Nelson did something else entirely. His flagship Victory drove at full speed perpendicular into the enemy line. This was a suicidal maneuver. During the approach, the ship exposes its bow to dozens of enemy cannons without any ability to return fire. It should have been destroyed, but immediately after breaking through the line, Victory dropped anchor. Hard, at full speed, the chain snapped taut, and the ship swung on it like a pendulum, presenting its broadside at point-blank range to two enemy ships at once. Every gun on one side fired simultaneously. The broadside hit several French ships before they had even processed what had happened. Then the anchor was raised, and Victory sailed away. The anchor had become a pivot point, an aiming mechanism, a precision weapon. But this maneuver demanded nerves of steel and perfect calculation. Miscalculate the speed of the chain's release, and the anchor tears through the hawse, punches through the hull from inside. The ship sinks itself with its own anchor. Japanese admirals at the Battle of Tsushima in 1905 used anchor chains in an even more calculated way. They pre-positioned chains under the water along the path of the Russian fleet. Invisible steel nets at a set depth. As the Russian squadrons advanced, the chains wrapped around their propellers, engines seized, ships lost power and became stationary targets. The anchor, symbol of safety and salvation, had become a trap. But let's return to the central question, to what most people simply do not know. How does an anchor actually hold a ship? Here's the first misconception that needs to be destroyed. An anchor does not hold a ship by its weight. Not at all. Let's do the math. The anchor of a supertanker weighs 30 tons. The tanker itself weighs 500,000 tons. The ratio is 1 to 15,000. That's like trying to stop a running elephant by tying a hamster to its leg. The weight of the anchor is negligible compared to the pressure of wind and current against the enormous hull of a vessel. If the anchor held purely by weight, the first serious storm would break any ship free. The second misconception, that an anchor grabs onto something on the bottom, a rock, a crevice, a ledge. But the reality is that the ocean floor in most places is a flat desert of sand or soft mud. There is nothing to grab onto. If you drop a hook on flat sand and pull horizontally, it simply plows a furrow. No resistance. The ship drifts. So what actually holds the ship? The chain holds the ship, not the anchor. The chain. When a vessel anchors, it doesn't just drop a piece of iron downward. It pays out chain, a great deal of chain. According to seamanship, the length of chain deployed must be 5 to 7 times the depth of the water. If the depth is 50 meters, 300 meters of heavy steel chain goes over the side. Each link weighs hundreds of kilograms. The result is not just an anchor on the bottom. There are hundreds of meters of solid metal lying on the seabed. It is the weight of that chain lying on the bottom that creates the enormous holding force. That is the real anchor. And here is the essential secret. The chain acts as a spring, as a shock absorber. When a wave shoves the ship backward, the vessel doesn't jerk the anchor directly. It must first lift the enormous massive chain off the bottom. All the energy of the impact goes into that lift. The wave passes, and the chain settles back to the bottom, pulling the ship back toward its original position. This is not rigid resistance. This is flexibility. The anchor system absorbs shocks not through stiffness, but through weight and catenary. Look at any painting of a ship at anchor. How is the chain drawn? Taut, stretched in a straight line at an angle from the bow down to the anchor. Beautiful, clean, tensioned. That is a picture of a disaster. If you see that in real life, the ship is already dragging. The correct picture looks different. The chain leaves the bow nearly vertically and then curves down in an arc along the bottom. That arc, that catenary curve, is the heart of the entire system. It acts as the spring. It absorbs the shocks. It prevents the anchor from being yanked upward. because the moment the chain straightens taut, it's over. The direction of pull angles upward, the anchor pops out of the seabed like a cork from a bottle. Sailors call this the anchor being up and down. The ship will drift into open water. And now, what happens when the system breaks down entirely? Sailors call it a runaway anchor. It sounds almost poetic. In reality, it is one of the most lethal accidents at sea. Imagine a fierce storm. A wave the height of a 5-story building throws the ship's bow skyward. The chain lurches violently. If the windlass brake fails, the chain begins flying out of the chain locker on its own, under its own weight. Accelerating, the chain reaches the speed of a freight train. The links grind against the metal so intensely they glow red hot. Everything in its path, railings, machinery, human beings, is annihilated. A burning steel serpent weighing hundreds of tons tears across the deck, killing everything alive within meters. In 1987, on the Soviet trawler Murmansk, the brake failed in a storm. The chain swept across the deck in seconds. 3 sailors died instantly. 2 others suffered severe burns from the superheated metal. Since then, emergency guillotines, steel blades capable of severing the chain in a single blow, have been installed on all major vessels, but even they don't always activate in time. The tool of salvation had become a killer. That is the runaway anchor. But an anchor can be designed to kill from the very start. Sometimes that is precisely its purpose. During the First World War, British military engineers invented the anchored mine. The concept was diabolically simple. An ordinary naval mine floats at or near the surface. It can be seen. It can be avoided. But what if you put a mine on an anchor? It hangs in the water column at a predetermined depth, invisible from above, invisible from below. A ship passes over it. The hull strikes the mine. Explosion! By the end of the war, the Straits of Europe were seeded with thousands of these traps. Sailors called these places gardens of death. And here is the most chilling part. Many of these mines are still down there, rusting, but still capable of detonating. Fishermen sometimes snag them with their trawls. The Coast Guard has to be called. Kilometers of shoreline get cordoned off. The anchor holds death on a leash, literally. Now let's go back 100 years, to the darkest moment of the Second World War. May 1940, Dunkirk. The British Expeditionary Force, more than 300,000 soldiers, is pinned against the sea. German armored divisions are only a few kilometers away. The Luftwaffe is bombing relentlessly from above. Behind them, the cold water of the English Channel. Ahead, nothing but ocean. Large warships cannot approach. The coastline here is wide, shallow sand flats. Destroyers would run aground a kilometer from shore. The piers have been bombed to rubble. The army seemed doomed. The British Admiralty put out a call to the nation. If you have a boat, come. And they came. Private yachts, fishing trawlers, pleasure cruisers, Thames river barges, hundreds of small vessels crewed by civilians, bankers, fishermen, pensioners. And the anchor became their primary tool of salvation. Think about how this worked in practice. A small boat approaches the surf line. Exhausted soldiers stand chest deep in freezing water. You cannot simply stop and drift. The channel current is powerful, and the tidal surge constantly pushes you toward shore. If the boat is pushed onto the sand, it becomes a coffin for everyone aboard. The captains of these little boats turned stern to shore and dropped the bow anchor. Then they paid out the chain, easing carefully backward, right to the outstretched hands of the men in the water. The anchor held the bow against the waves. Without it, the boats would have been spun sideways and capsized. Take on the men, haul in on the windlass back to deeper water, raise the anchor, transfer the men to a larger ship, head back to the beach, and again. For days, without sleep, under fire, 338,000 soldiers were saved. The army went home. 4 years later, it came back through Normandy. The anchors of those fishing boats held that army at the shoreline, and through it, perhaps the entire outcome of the war. And now, the most ill-fated anchor in all of recorded history. Christmas Eve, 1492. The warm waters off the coast of the island we now call Haiti. The flagship of Christopher Columbus, the Santa Maria, drifts slowly in the night silence. The admiral, sleepless for 2 days, had finally collapsed into his bunk. The watch officer had fallen asleep too. The helm was left to a ship's boy. Picture this scene: an enormous wooden ship in the darkness, a treacherous current, invisible at the surface but powerful below, slowly dragging the heavy vessel toward the coral reef. The boy at the helm notices nothing until the water begins to foam and bubble over the shallows beneath the keel. He shouts, the crew stumbles out. Columbus reaches the deck. The only chance, the anchor. Now, immediately. The anchor goes into the water. But it was dropped in panic at too great a drift speed with too little rope. The fluke catches on the coral, but the angle of the line is too steep. Instead of digging in and holding, the anchor skips, then is torn loose by the jolt. It doesn't hold. A moment later, the keel of the Santa Maria strikes the reef with a sound Columbus would describe as unbearable. The flagship is lost. Here is what this failure meant for history. Columbus had only 2 small ships remaining, the Niña and the Pinta. There was no room for the full crew of the lost flagship. 39 sailors had to be left on the island. From the wreckage of the Santa Maria, they built a fortified camp, Fort Navidad, the Christmas fort. So because of one failed anchor, the first permanent European settlement in the New World was established. If the anchor had held, Columbus would have taken his entire crew home to Spain. Colonization might have followed a completely different script, delayed by years or decades. But the anchor failed, and Europeans were forced to put down roots in foreign soil right there, right then. The history of the Americas began with an emergency stop that didn't work. Today, the most advanced ships carry no traditional anchors at all. Their replacement is called a dynamic positioning system, DP. Picture this. A drilling platform stands in the middle of the ocean over a wellhead. The water beneath it is several kilometers deep. Hurricane-force winds are blowing. The platform does not move a centimeter. Beneath its hull are several independent thrusters pointing in different directions. A computer receives GPS satellite data every fraction of a second. If the wind pushes the platform left, the system instantly fires the lateral thrusters to compensate. If a wave tries to turn the bow, the stern thrusters correct the heading. This is not passive resistance. This is active combat. The platform literally dances in place, making millions of micro-corrections invisible to the human eye. In 2005, the Norwegian drilling platform Statfjord C was caught in what meteorologists called the storm of the century in the North Sea. Waves reached 28 meters, the height of a 9-story building, wind like a wall. Any traditional anchor would have been ripped from the seabed in seconds. The DP system ran for 72 hours without interruption. Computers performed millions of corrections. When the storm ended, engineers examined the data. The platform had drifted from its original position by exactly 3 meters. 3 meters. Over 3 days of hell, the anchor had become mathematics. And yet iron has not disappeared entirely, because mathematics cannot grip the seabed in shallow harbors or river mouths. Metal is still needed there. Soviet engineer Matrosov in the mid-20th century designed an anchor with wide flat flanges on its flukes. The Matrosov anchor doesn't just enter the ground, it suctions into the mud. Its holding force is 4 times its own weight. That is why it is used on landing craft that need to lock onto weak ground in seconds, and for oil platforms in the North Sea, where storms rage for months without end, mushroom anchors are used. They are not dropped. They are screwed or driven into the seabed. Over time, their caps become buried in silt, creating a vacuum effect. Trying to extract one is like trying to pull a boot out of meter-deep mud, only 1,000,000 times harder. They are often left on the bottom permanently. When a platform is decommissioned, the chains are simply cut. The steel mushrooms remain on the seabed forever, monuments to engineering in its most extreme form. One last fact that demands a moment of thought. No anchor in existence can hold a modern ocean liner if the captain engages full ahead. The power of a supertanker's propellers is sufficient to snap any chain or tear up a section of the ocean floor. An anchor is a parking brake, not an emergency brake, not a crash stop. If a massive vessel loses control and bears down on a pier, dropping the anchor is pointless. The chain will tighten, heat from friction will glow the links red, sparks will fly, and the chain will snap like thread. You cannot argue with physics. We began this conversation with a simple question. How does a small piece of iron hold 200,000 tons of steel in place? Now you know the answer. It doesn't. The chain does it in gravity and friction and the geometry of the catenary curve. The anchor is merely the last point in the system. Its job is to lie horizontal and keep the chain from walking away. The strength of an anchor is not rigidity. It is flexibility, not stubbornness, the ability to absorb a blow. The sea has been teaching humanity the same lesson for thousands of years. To withstand the force of a storm, you don't need to be hard. You need to know how to bend, absorb the shock, use the weight and momentum of the opposition in your favor. The anchor is not a symbol of stopping. It is a symbol of reliability inside chaos, a symbol that the most important things are sometimes hidden from view, deep below the surface where no one is looking. And now, you know exactly how it works.